share a few thoughts. So we read today that Jesus is the Good Shepherd, and the Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's a great thought. We have a picture of the shepherd of the sheep casting himself into the very jowls of death for the sake of his sheep. Now, we considered this a little bit on Sunday, and the more I considered it, the more incredible it became that the shepherd should give himself into the jaws of the lion for the sake of the sheep. Because it would be common for a shepherd to have a staff and a rod. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Most people know what a staff is. They don't know what the rod was. The rod was oftentimes another stick that was more like a club, often taken from the bush and the root. And you would cut out the knobby root with fingers sticking out. And so you would have a club about this long with a big knob on the end with some pretty nasty bumps. Not something you'd want to get hit with. The shepherd cares for his sheep, and he leads his sheep beside still waters, and he restores their souls. He defends them. He comforts them with his rod and staff. These are all comforting thoughts. We like the idea that the shepherd is going to protect us. We like the idea that the shepherd is going to lead us in and out to find pasture. But where is the shepherd leading? Sometimes the shepherd is leading us through the valley of the shadow of death. This is difficult. It reminds me of the passage where it says, this calls for patient endurance. This calls for the patient endurance of the saints. This passage in 1 Peter also makes me think about that. Let's see, where was that now? He says, for what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer for it, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. The fact is that most of us don't know how to suffer patiently. That's really hard to do, to suffer patiently. And now, as states contemplate what's going to continue to remain open, or how they're going to open businesses up or open up their states, and at what pace, some states are continuing to extend stay-at-home orders, continuing to extend the closure of businesses. And we are getting impatient. This is hard. This is hard. It's hard for us to suffer patiently. The world doesn't want to suffer patiently. In fact, the world wants to take up its own rod and go, I refuse to suffer patiently, and they're ready to riot in the street because we can't suffer patiently. But here's the thing about the Christian faith and the gospel. And this is something that people just don't seem to understand these days. So we think that the Christian faith is all about a proposition of belief. I believe that Jesus is God. Or I don't believe that Jesus is God. And that's about it. And what separates a believer from a person who's not a believer is what they think about God. Do they believe in God? Do they not believe in God? Do they believe in Jesus? Do they not believe in Jesus? Do they believe that going to church is important? Do they not believe that going to church is important? That is probably the most superficial proposition for what belief is. But the true Christian faith is formative. Amen. It's not just about what you believe up here. It's how you are being transformed throughout your entire being. Right. And that takes place over a long period of time by submission to sufferings, by submission to hardship, by submission to the commandments of God, even when we don't feel like submitting. Oh, Lord. This is the hard work. This This is what separates genuine Christianity from a facsimile. This is one of the reasons why, as we go through this period of time, we continue to promote learning how to develop a rule of prayer for your life. That you pick up a prayer book and you learn how to use a prayer book on a daily basis, because you're establishing a rule even when you don't feel like it. You pick up your prayer rule and you pray. This is not just because you have a duty to pray. This is not because it's merely an ought or a should. A good Christian should pray. A good Christian should do these things, ought to do these things. No. What happens is, as we pick up all of these disciplines, discipline. Ouch. As we pick up these disciplines, these daily habits, we develop patience. And these things change us. I learned a new word this last week, a new concept. It's called hormesis. And it's the idea, in fact, it was introduced, I don't know, over 100 years ago, and then the scientist who introduced it was sort of discredited for a while. It was the idea that you could introduce a stressor, and by introducing a stressor in the right measure, it makes something stronger. And so that was discredited for a while, but really that's coming back, that concept. What we're finding is that all things can be strengthened by introducing just the right amount of stressor. Too much stressor and you kill it. But if there are no stressors and no ways to deal with those stressors, that can also be harmful as well. Then that can create a failure to thrive. For example, when we raise our kids and we shield them from all stressors so that they don't have to feel and experience what it feels like to fail or endure hardship. Well, when we're shielding them from those stressors that are healthy, that actually promote growth and resiliency. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been talking about our need to develop spiritual resiliency. As Christians, all of the things that we do, what we suffer patiently, helps to build spiritual resilience. Now that might be a new term for a lot of people. If you've ever heard anything like that, you would think of emotional resilience or psychological resilience. This is the idea that somebody is able to go through psychological stressors, hardships. Maybe they had a rough childhood. Maybe there was a lot of heartache or pain. And yet they seem to bounce back from all of that and survive it and actually thrive in spite of it because they have a high level of resilience. Psychologists don't actually really understand why one person is more resilient than another. Right? Some people don't have resilience. They go through hardship and trials and struggles and they collapse. They fold inwards upon themselves. They develop maladaptive behaviors. Christians can do the same thing. The same thing can happen to us spiritually.
That's right.
Spiritually, we can develop maladaptive behaviors. We don't think about that. I sometimes wonder if all of our contemporary patterns of worship might be a little bit maladaptive. In other words, it gives us an opportunity to feel good, but not to be good. It gives us an opportunity to get a spiritual or temporary emotional charge. It's emotive, but it's not transformative in the long term. Yes, I know some people say, well, it's transformative because I had a revelation from Jesus. And believe me, I spent my years in the evangelical world and the Pentecostal world. I kind of know what that's. I know that language. All right? And so you get a nice revelation and you feel emotionally charged by that. And oftentimes that sits with you and that's really good in and of itself. I'm not categorically denying it by any means. But also it can become maladaptive when we begin to place our trust in those experiences and we lust for those experiences instead of trusting in God.
Amen.
And so we have to be careful that we don't develop maladaptive spiritual patterns and behaviors. How do I deal with hardship? Can I suffer patiently? One of the things that we don't understand is that this suffering patiently is almost like currency in the kingdom of heaven. If you don't believe me, just think about the fact that you were bought with a price through the precious blood of Christ. If that's not a spiritual currency, I don't know what is. God took the sufferings of Jesus Christ. He suffered and died on the cross. And that suffering was turned to a spiritual currency to buy your soul and my soul.
Thank you, Jesus.
And all the entire world. And so all the world is his. He bought it. He bought it. He bought us, Paul says. We have been purchased through the blood of Christ. But what does it say? How were we purchased? For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example. He suffered patiently, that you should follow in his steps. Who committed no sin, nor was guile found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. That takes spiritual resilience. That takes learning how to suffer patiently. Do you think he just woke up in the morning because he's God? And so we didn't share enough of our humanity to really have to learn this? No. It says that he learned obedience through suffering. He suffered, and he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. That means that he was waiting patiently through his suffering to be justified on the other end. Who himself bore our sins in his own body on a tree. That takes spiritual resilience. That we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you are healed. Boy, that's currency. For you were like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. This is why the shepherd must give his life for the sheep. And this is why we must return to the shepherd and overseer of our souls. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.
Amen.
Amen.